In the spring of 2018, the air crackled with tension as the U.S. government made a bold move that would send shockwaves through the global economy. President Trump, who had long campaigned on the promise of putting America first, announced a sweeping tariff policy that imposed a baseline 10% tariff on most imports. This was not merely a financial maneuver, it was a declaration of economic warfare, a rallying cry for protectionism that would redefine trade relationships around the world. The tariffs were particularly severe for certain countries, with a staggering 54% levy on Chinese goods and a 20% tariff on products from the European Union. As the ink dried on the executive order, the world braced for the fallout. The immediate reaction from China was swift and resolute. The government, led by President Xi Jinping, viewed the tariffs as an affront to their economic sovereignty and a direct challenge to their ambitions on the global stage. Within days, China retaliated with its own set of tariffs, imposing a 34% levy on U.S. imports. This was not merely a tit-for-tat response. It was a calculated move designed to inflict pain on American producers and send a message that China would not back down. To compound matters, China devalued its currency, the yuan, making its exports cheaper and more competitive while simultaneously increasing the cost of American goods in the Chinese market. The stakes had been raised, and the trade war was officially underway. As the tension escalated, the European Union found itself in a precarious position. The EU had long been a staunch ally of the United States, but the new tariffs threatened to unravel decades of cooperative trade practices. In response to the growing crisis, EU leaders proposed a zero-for-zero tariff agreement, suggesting that both sides eliminate tariffs entirely to restore balance and promote free trade. However, this olive branch was accompanied by a preparation for countermeasures as the EU began drafting its own list of tariffs on American goods, ready to respond should the U.S. refuse to budge. As these tariffs took effect, the financial markets reacted with unprecedented volatility. Investors, uncertain of the future and fearful of a prolonged trade war, began to pull back. The S&P 500, a barometer of the American economy, plummeted more than 10% within just 2 days, a stark indicator of the widespread panic that had gripped Wall Street. Economists were quick to weigh in, with institutions like J.P. Morgan predicting a 60% likelihood of a global recession. The warnings were dire. The tariffs could stifle GDP growth in the U.S. and lead to rising inflation, which would ultimately impact consumer prices and business investments. The interconnected nature of the global economy meant that the repercussions would be felt far beyond American borders. Particular sectors bore the brunt of these economic shifts. The energy sector, already sensitive to fluctuations in prices, faced rising costs from tariffs on imports from Canada. This could potentially drive up gasoline prices, a burden that would be felt by everyday consumers. Manufacturing, a cornerstone of the American economy, found itself vulnerable as supply chains were disrupted and export markets shrank. Agriculture, too, faced significant challenges, particularly for farmers who relied heavily on exports to China. As tariffs took effect, many began to fear that their livelihoods were at risk, prompting calls for government intervention and support. Nations that were heavily dependent on trade with the U.S. began to seek out alternative markets and partnerships. China, Canada, and Mexico started to explore new avenues for trade, looking to strengthen ties with other countries in a bid to cushion the blow of the tariffs. This shift in strategy signaled a potential reconfiguration of global trade relationships as countries sought to reduce their reliance on the U.S. market. The ramifications of this pivot would be profound, threatening to erode American influence in international economic matters. From a consumer perspective, the tariffs were anticipated to elevate prices on imported goods, effectively lowering disposable income for many families. Reports estimated that the average American household could face an annual increase of around $1,800, a significant sum that could dampen consumer spending and further impede economic growth. The prospect of higher prices for everyday items like clothing, electronics, and food loomed large, leading to a sense of anxiety among families who were already grappling with rising costs of living. As the trade war escalated, the geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically. Long-standing allies began to reassess their relationships with the United States, questioning the reliability of a partner that had suddenly turned to protectionism. The European Union, once seen as a steadfast ally, began to reconsider its trade agreements with the U.S., looking for ways to strengthen regional collaboration and lessen their reliance on American markets. Asian countries, too, began to explore new trade partnerships, seeking to create a buffer against the unpredictable nature of U.S. trade policy. The aggressive tariff strategies put forth by President Trump had unleashed considerable uncertainty in the global market. As countries scrambled to respond, the world watched with bated breath, wondering how far the conflict would escalate. Would the U.S. double down on its tariffs, or would cooler heads prevail? The future of international trade hung in the balance, with the potential for profound shifts in relationships that had been built over decades. In the midst of this turmoil, businesses began to reassess their strategies. Companies that had relied on global supply chains found themselves grappling with increased costs and disruptions. Manufacturers faced tough choices: absorb the costs of tariffs, pass them on to consumers, or seek alternative suppliers. Each decision carried its own set of risks, and for many, the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. The agricultural sector was particularly hard hit. Farmers, who had once looked to China as a promising market for their goods, suddenly found themselves confronted with tariffs that made their products less competitive. The fear of losing access to critical export markets led many to lobby for government support, urging policymakers to find a resolution to the trade war before it was too late. As harvest season approached, the stakes grew higher, and the anxiety among farmers became palpable. Meanwhile, in corporate boardrooms across the country, executives convened emergency meetings to strategize for the uncertain future. Some companies began to explore options for relocating production to countries less affected by tariffs, seeking to protect their bottom line while navigating the treacherous waters of international trade. Others invested in lobbying efforts, hoping to influence policymakers to reconsider the aggressive tariff policies that threatened to upend their businesses. As the situation unfolded, the media buzzed with speculation and analysis. Pundits debated the potential outcomes of the trade war, weighing the risks and rewards of various strategies. Some argued that the tariffs were a necessary step to protect American jobs and industries, while others warned that the long-term consequences could be dire. The narrative that emerged was one of division, with opinions sharply polarized along political lines. In the halls of power, the administration faced mounting pressure to justify its actions. Supporters of the tariffs pointed to a growing trade deficit and the need to protect American workers, while critics decried the potential for a global economic downturn. The stakes were high, and the administration found itself in a precarious position, balancing the demands of its base against the realities of an interconnected world. As the months wore on, the trade war continued to escalate, with each side digging in its heels. Negotiations took place behind closed doors, but progress was slow, and the rhetoric grew increasingly hostile. The prospect of a resolution seemed distant, and the global economy braced for the possibility of a protracted conflict. In the face of uncertainty, consumers began to feel the impact of the tariffs in their everyday lives. Prices for imported goods began to rise, and the once familiar aisles of supermarkets took on a different feel. Families adjusted their budgets, cutting back on discretionary spending as they braced for the financial strain ahead. The sense of unease permeated the air as the implications of the trade war became more tangible. As the world watched, the unfolding drama of the trade war served as a reminder of the fragility of global economic relationships. The interconnectedness of nations, once seen as a source of strength, now felt like a double-edged sword. The decisions made in Washington had repercussions that rippled across continents, reshaping the landscape of international trade in ways that no one could have predicted. In the end, the ramifications of the tariff policies put forth by President Trump would hinge on future policy choices and the strategies adopted by the nations involved. The world stood at a crossroads, with the potential for profound shifts in trade relationships and geopolitical alliances. As the dust settled on this tumultuous chapter, one thing became clear. The landscape of global trade had been irrevocably altered, and the path forward would require careful navigation in a world forever changed by the echoes of a trade war.